The silence in the apartment wasn't peaceful. It was heavy like the air before a tornado touches down. Grant Foster dropped his hard hat on the entryway table, expecting the usual chaos of dinner time, the smell of burnt mac and cheese, the screaming of the twins, the television blaring cartoons. Instead, he heard only the rhythmic dripping of a leaky faucet and the wind howling off Lake Michigan, rattling the thin panes of glass. On the kitchen counter, illuminated by a single flickering bulb, sat his wedding band, a stack of unpaid utility bills, and a note that would dismantle his world in 10 words. If stories about resilience, the brutal price of loyalty, and the kind of love that survives the wreckage speak to you, stay with me. The wind off Lake Michigan had a bite to it that could freeze the marrow in a man's bones, but Grant Foster didn't feel the cold. He felt only the phantom weight of the world he thought he was carrying, a weight that had suddenly violently shifted. He stood in the hallway of his third-floor walk-up in the loft district. The door was open. It shouldn't have been. "Sav," Grant called out. His voice was gravelly, worn down by 10 hours of shouting orders over the roar of jackhammers and cement mixers at the Sullivan site. Silence answered him. Not the comfortable silence of a sleeping house, but the hollow vacuum-sealed silence of a place that had been stripped. Grant stepped inside his steel-toed boots, heavy on the hardwood. The living room looked normal at first glance, the worn beige sofa, the pile of blocks in the corner, the television mounted on the wall. But the air smelled different. It lacked the scent of Savannah's vanilla perfume. It smelled of stale diaper pell and dust. He walked into the kitchen. On the counter where dinner should have been waiting, or at least the chaotic remnants of a meal preparation, there was only the Formica surface. And 3 items arranged with cruel precision. His wedding band. A gold circle he had placed on her finger 5 years ago, promising forever. A stack of envelopes, final notices for the electric bill, the credit card, the car loan, and a piece of paper torn from a spiral notebook. Grant picked it up. His hands, rough and calloused, stained with the gray dust of concrete, trembled slightly. "I can't do this anymore, Grant. I'm drowning in this life. I need to breathe. Don't come looking for me. I'm finally going to be happy." "Shiraning," he whispered the word, tasting like ash. A sound pierced the silence, a whimper escalating quickly into a wail. It came from the twins' room. Grant dropped the note. He ran down the short hallway, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He pushed open the door to the nursery. Leo and Mia were standing in their cribs, their faces red, tears tracking through dried splotches of snot. They were wearing dirty onesies. The room was freezing. The window had been left cracked open. Hey, Daddy's here." Grant choked out, scooping Mia up with one arm and Leo with the other. They were heavy, damp, and terrified. He looked around the room. The dresser drawers were open. Savannah's clothes, the few nice things she had bought for herself, were gone. But the kids' clothes were still there. Their toys were there. She hadn't taken them. The realization hit Grant with the force of a wrecking ball. She hadn't just left him. She had left them. She had looked at these 2 innocent faces, weighed them against whatever freedom she was chasing, and decided they were baggage she didn't want to carry. He walked back into the living room, clutching his children to his chest as they sobbed into his flannel shirt. He moved to the window, looking down at the rainy Chicago street. A black town car was just pulling away from the curb, its taillights blurring into red streaks in the downpour. He didn't know who was driving, but he knew with a sickening gut instinct that Savannah was inside. Grant looked down at the note on the counter again. Next to it, his phone buzzed. A text from his boss, Sullivan. "Need you early tomorrow. Pouring the foundation for the West Loop project. Don't be late." Grant looked at the unpaid bills. He looked at the wedding ring that wasn't his. It was hers, the one he'd spent 6 months saving for. She had left it behind like a tip at a restaurant. He sank onto the sofa, the twins curling into the warmth of his chest, their cries subsiding into hiccuping breaths. The apartment was dark, cold, and empty. "Just us now," Grant whispered into Mia's hair. "It's just us." But as he stared at the skyline out the window, the jagged teeth of the city against the night sky, something hardened in Grant's eyes. The grief was there, yes. But beneath it, the bedrock was shifting. The alarm clock on the bedside table didn't buzz. It screamed. It was 4:15 a.m., a time when the city of Chicago was nothing but gray shadows and biting wind. Grant Foster slapped the snooze button with a hand that felt made of lead, his eyes burning as if they were filled with sand. For the 30th day in a row, he woke up reaching for the other side of the bed. His hand met cold sheets. The memory of Savannah's absence hit him fresh, a daily bruise that refused to heal. He rolled out of bed, the floorboards creaking under his weight. The apartment was a minefield of chaos. Laundry was piled on the sofa, tiny socks, onesies, his own work shirts, stiff with drywall dust. The sink was full of bottles that needed washing. The air smelled of sour milk and anxiety. Grant moved on autopilot. He showered in 3 minutes cold, the water shocking his system awake. He dressed in the dark jeans, flannel, heavy boots, and then began the delicate operation of waking the twins. "Come on, buddy. Come on, sweetie," he whispered, lifting Leo and Mia from their cribs. They were dead weight in his arms, groggy and limp. Mia started to whine, a high-pitched sound that grated against Grant's fraying nerves. "Shh, please, Mia. Not today. Daddy can't take the noise today." He bundled them into their car seats, their heads lolling. He carried them down 3 flights of stairs to his truck, the wind whipping his face. He drove to Mrs. Higgins' house 3 blocks away. She was an elderly neighbor who watched them for cash. Cash Grant was running out of rapidly. "They're teething," Grant told her at the door, handing over a bag of diapers. "Mia needs the gel if she cries." Mrs. Higgins looked at him with pity. That was the worst part of the last month, the pity in everyone's eyes. "You look tired, Grant. Maybe you should take a day." "If I take a day, we don't eat," Grant said, his voice flat. "I'll be back by 6. The job site was a different kind of war zone. They were pouring concrete for the foundation of a new high-rise in the West Loop. It was dangerous, loud, and unforgiving. "Foster head in the game," Sullivan roared from across the pit. Grant blinked, realizing he had been staring at his phone, waiting for an update from Mrs. Higgins. He shoved the phone into his pocket and grabbed his shovel. He worked with a manic intensity, trying to sweat out the anger, trying to exhaust himself so thoroughly that he wouldn't dream when he slept. But the distraction was lethal. Around noon, a crane-load of steel rebar swung too close. Grant was a second slow to react. The jagged metal clipped his shoulder, spinning him around and knocking him into the mud. "Damn it, Grant!" Sullivan was over him in a second, his face red. "You're a liability out here. I know you've got problems at home, son, but if you get someone killed, I don't care how sad your story is. You're done." Grant lay in the mud, the cold seeping into his clothes. His shoulder throbbed. He looked up at the steel skeleton of the building against the gray sky. For a second, he wanted to just stay there, just close his eyes and let the concrete harden around him. "I'm good," Grant grunted, forcing himself up. "Won't happen again." He finished the shift, but the drive home was a blur. When he picked up the kids, Mrs. Higgins told him Leo had a fever and she couldn't take them tomorrow because she had a doctor's appointment. Grant walked into his apartment carrying 2 crying children and a bag of groceries he could barely afford. He set the kids down in the playpen and went to the kitchen to make formula. His hands were shaking so badly he dropped the canister. Powdered formula exploded across the floor, a white dusty mess covering the cheap linoleum. It was a small thing, a spilled can, but it broke him. Grant sank to his knees in the white powder. He didn't clean it up. He just sat there, his head in his hands, and let out a sound that wasn't quite a scream and wasn't quite a sob. It was the sound of a man being crushed. He looked at the unpaid bills on the counter. He looked at the empty ring finger on his left hand. He looked at the formula on the floor that cost $20 he needed for gas. "She's not coming back," a voice in his head whispered. "You can't do this. You are failing them." Leo threw a plastic block from the playpen. It skittered across the floor and hit Grant's boot. Grant looked up. Leo was standing holding the rail, watching him with wide dark eyes. He wasn't crying anymore. He was just watching his father. Grant wiped his face with his dirty sleeve. He looked at the mess. He looked at his son. "Okay," Grant said. The word was rough but steady. "Okay." He stood up. He didn't clean the floor yet. He walked to the bedroom, opened the bottom drawer of his dresser, and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a gold watch, his grandfather's retirement gift, the only thing of value he owned besides his truck. He snapped the box shut. It would pay for a real daycare. It would buy him a month of breathing room. He walked back to the kitchen, grabbed the broom, and started to sweep. The trench was deep and it was dark, but he wasn't going to die in it. 3 weeks after selling the watch, the crushing weight of panic had settled into a dull, rhythmic ache. Grant's life had become a series of timed logistics: drop off at the new daycare, at 6 a.m. site by 6:30 pour concrete, until 4 pickup at 4:30. He was a machine fueled by black coffee and the terror of poverty. But on this particular Tuesday, the machine ground to a halt. The West Loop site was in chaos. The crew was standing around the rebar cages of the third floor idling. That was bad. Idling men meant money burning. Sullivan, Grant's boss, was red-faced, screaming at a group of men in pristine hard hats and expensive suits, the architects from the firm downtown. Grant wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of a glove and walked over. The issue was the HVAC clearance. The blueprints called for a duct run that physically couldn't fit between the steel beams they had just installed. "I'm telling you, the drawings are correct." The lead architect, a man named Miller, who looked like he'd never held a shovel in his life, was tapping a rolled-up schematic against his palm. "If it doesn't fit, your team poured the columns wrong." "My team poured it exactly to the spec," Sullivan roared back. "The spec is garbage." Standing behind Miller, almost invisible in a hard hat that was slightly too big for her, was a young woman. She was holding the overflow of documents, her eyes darting between the angry men and the steel beams above. Grant stepped into the circle. "The columns are right," he said, his voice low but cutting through the shouting. Miller turned, looking Grant up and down with a sneer. "And who are you?" "I'm the foreman who measured them," Grant said. He didn't back down. He pointed a gloved finger at the ceiling. "You've got 18 inches of clearance on the drawing. In reality, with the fireproofing spray you ordered, you've got 14. The duct is 16. It won't fit. Physics doesn't care about your drawing." Miller opened his mouth to berate him, but the woman behind him spoke up. "He's right." The silence was instant. Miller spun around. "Excuse me." The woman stepped forward. She was small, but her posture was rigid. "I checked the subcontractor specs on the fireproofing yesterday, Mr. Miller. I sent you a memo. The thickness was increased for code compliance. We didn't update the structural drawings to match." Miller turned purple. He snatched the clipboard from her, scanned it, and then glared at Grant. "Fix it! Reroute it!" he barked at Sullivan, then stormed off toward the construction elevator, leaving the young woman standing there. The site slowly roared back to life as Sullivan went to yell at someone else. Grant remained standing by the steel pillar. The woman didn't leave. She was staring at the confusing web of lines on the blueprint she was holding. "Nice catch," Grant said. It was the first time he had spoken to anyone on the site about anything other than work orders in a month. She looked up. She had tired eyes framed by dark circles that matched his own. "It wasn't a nice catch. It was a mistake. I'm Rachel. Rachel Green. Grant Foster." He didn't offer a hand. His were covered in grime. "You sent a memo." "Nobody reads the memos from the junior associates," she said, a bitter edge to her voice. She rolled up the drawing. "They just want us to print the PDFs and get coffee. They don't care that the building actually has to stand up." Grant looked at her, really looked at her. He saw a mirror of his own frustration. She was competent, sharp, and completely undervalued. "Let me see that," Grant said, nodding at the roll in her hand. Rachel hesitated, then handed it over. Grant unrolled the blueprints on a stack of drywall. For years, he had looked at these pages as instructions lines that told him where to pour, where to cut. But as he looked now, with Rachel tracing the path of the ductwork, with her finger explaining how she would have designed it to avoid the beam, something clicked. He realized that the power wasn't in the pouring of the concrete. The power was in the ink. The person who drew the lines controlled the money, the timeline, and the reality of the city. "You'd have routed it through the chase in the north wall," Grant murmured, seeing the logic. "Yes," Rachel said, surprised he followed. "It saves 40 feet of ducting and avoids the structural issue entirely." But Miller said it was unconventional. "It's smart," Grant corrected. He looked at her. "You know how this building works better than he does." "Doesn't matter," she shrugged, taking the drawings back. "I'm just the assistant." "It matters," Grant said. The wind whipped through the open floor, cold and harsh, but he felt a fire lighting in his chest for the first time since Savannah left. "It matters if you want to be the one giving the orders instead of taking them." Rachel looked at him, a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. And what about you, Grant? You plan on pouring concrete forever? Grant looked out at the skyline, the Sears Tower, the John Hancock, the massive monuments of steel and glass. He thought of Leo and Mia in a daycare he could barely afford. He thought of Savannah probably sipping champagne in a penthouse right now. No, Grant said, his voice hard as iron. I'm done just building other people's dreams. I'm going to learn how to draw my own. He turned back to her. Teach me how to read the rest of that. The deep stuff, the codes, the load calculations. Rachel raised an eyebrow. And why would I do that? Because Grant said, picking up his shovel, I'm the only one here who listened to you. Time in Chicago didn't pass in days or weeks. It passed in layers of clothing shed and donned in the freezing of the lake and the thawing of the pavement. For Grant, the next 5 years were a blur of gray concrete, black coffee, and the blinding white light of a desk lamp at 2 a.m. The kitchen table in the loft had ceased to be a place for meals. It was now the headquarters of a two-front war. On one side lay the coloring books and spelling homework of Leo and Mia, now 7 years old. On the other side lay Grant's textbooks, structural engineering principles, construction management contract law. Grant wasn't just working for Sullivan anymore. He was running the sites. He had traded the shovel for a clipboard, the flannel for a button-down that strained against his shoulders. But the promotion came with a new kind of exhaustion. He worked 10 hours on site, came home to cook dinner and put the kids to bed, and then drove to the community college or studied until his eyes watered. Rachel was a fixture in this routine. She wasn't living with them, boundaries were strictly maintained, but she was the architect of his education. She sat across from him on Tuesday nights, drilling him on load-bearing calculations, her patience infinite compared to his short fuse. You're rushing the math, Rachel said one rainy November evening, tapping her pen on his notebook. If you miscalculate the shear force, the beam fails. If the beam fails, people die. Do it again. Grant rubbed his face, the stubble scratching his palms. I'm tired, Rachel. I've been up since 4. Do you want to go back to pouring the foundation? She asked, her voice soft but unyielding. Or do you want to own the building? Grant looked at the closed door of the twins' bedroom. He picked up the pencil. I want the building. But the grind took its toll in quiet moments. It was the parent-teacher conferences he barely made it to, still smelling of sawdust. It was the dark circles that became permanent fixtures under his eyes. And it was the questions that finally started to come. It happened on a Sunday. Grant was folding laundry on the sofa while the twins watched a movie. A scene played on the screen, a mother hugging her child goodbye at a school gate. Leo turned around, his legs dangling off the cushion. He looked so much like Savannah in that moment, the shape of his eyes, the curve of his chin, that Grant felt a phantom pain in his chest. But Grant knew the secret that lay beneath that resemblance, a secret he buried deeper every time he looked at the boy. Dad? Leo asked, his voice small. Where is she? Grant froze. He didn't have to ask who. They had never really spoken about it. Grant had filled the space with noise and activity, hoping they wouldn't notice the silence where a mother should be. Who, Bud? Grant asked, stalling. Our mom, Mia chimed in, not looking away from the TV. Kevin at school said everyone has a mom. He said ours must be dead. The rage flared in Grant's gut, hot and instantaneous. He wanted to find Kevin's parents. He wanted to scream. But he looked at his children, at the innocent curiosity in their faces. They weren't judging him. They just wanted to know their coordinates in the world. Grant set the laundry basket down. He walked over and sat on the coffee table facing them. He took a breath, the air shuddering in his lungs. She's not dead, Grant said. He had rehearsed this speech 1,000 times in the shower, but the words felt like gravel in his throat. But she wasn't ready to be a mom. Being a parent is the hardest job in the world. It takes a strong back and a strong heart. And she had to go somewhere else to be happy. Did we make her sad? Leo asked, his brow furrowing. No, Grant said firmly, reaching out to grip Leo's shoulder. He squeezed tight, perhaps too tight. No, you two are the best thing that ever happened to this family. She didn't leave because of you. She left because she was weak, and we are strong. Do you understand, the three of us? We are the steel. We don't bend. Leo nodded, though Grant wasn't sure he understood. Mia just leaned over and hugged Grant's arm. "I like it with just us anyway," she whispered. Grant kissed the top of her head, closing his eyes against the sting of tears he refused to shed. He looked over Mia's shoulder at the textbooks on the table. He wasn't doing this for a bigger house. He wasn't doing this for a new truck. He was doing this so that one day, when they were old enough to understand the magnitude of what had been stolen from them, he could hand them the world as compensation. The next day, Grant passed his final certification exam. He walked into Sullivan's office and placed his license on the desk. "I don't want a raise," Grant told the old man. "I want equity. Make me a partner, or I walk and take the crew with me." Sullivan looked at the man Grant had become, hardened, educated, and desperate. He smiled. "I've been waiting for you to ask." The air in Thomas Sullivan's office always smelled of stale cigar smoke and old money, but today there was an undercurrent of something else: finality. It had been 7 years since the night Grant found the empty ring on the counter. 7 years of climbing from the mud of the foundation pit to the mahogany chair he now sat in. His hands were cleaner now, the calluses smoothed over, but the grit remained in his eyes. Sullivan poured 2 fingers of scotch into a crystal glass and slid it across the desk. It was barely noon. "I'm tired, Grant," Sullivan said, sinking into his leather chair. The old man looked it. His skin was papery, his breathing a little too loud in the quiet room. "The doctors say my heart is ticking like a cheap watch. I want out. I want to go to Florida and fish until I die." Grant didn't touch the drink. "We have 3 major projects breaking ground next month. The South Loop redevelopment alone is—" "I know what it is," Sullivan interrupted. "That's why I'm offering it to you first. I've had offers from the big firms in New York. They want to buy the client list and strip the assets. They'll fire the crews. They'll turn this place into a satellite office." Sullivan slid a folder across the desk. "I want you to take it. You built half this city anyway." Grant opened the folder. The number at the bottom of the valuation sheet made his stomach drop. It was a fair price for a company of this size, but for a single father with a mortgage and 2 kids in private school, it was astronomical. $4 million. "I don't have this kind of capital, Thomas," Grant said quietly. "The banks know you," Sullivan countered. "They know you run the operations. You put up the collateral, they'll finance the buyout. But you have to take the debt. All of it." Grant walked out of the office and straight into the conference room where Rachel was waiting. She was no longer the shy assistant. She was the lead architect, sharp and formidable. She took one look at Grant's face and closed the door. "He gave you the number," she stated. Grant tossed the folder on the table. "He wants $4 million. I have to leverage everything. The house, my savings, the kids' college funds. If the market dips even by a percentage point, I lose it all. We're back to the rental in the loft district." Rachel picked up the paper. She scanned the financials, her mind working through the risk. "The interest rates are climbing, Grant. The South Loop project is high risk. If the zoning doesn't clear in time, the debt service will drown you in 6 months." "I know," Grant said. He walked to the window, looking down at the street. He saw men in suits walking with purpose, men who owned the ground they walked on. He thought about Savannah. He had heard rumors she was living in Miami now, still with Chase, still floating on a bubble of someone else's money. He turned back to Rachel. "I'm not doing this to be safe. I'm doing this so that no one can ever take the roof from over my kids' heads again. If I work for someone else, I'm expendable. If I own it, I'm the law." "It's a gamble," Rachel warned, though her eyes were shining with a dangerous excitement. "You're betting the farm." "I'm betting on us," Grant corrected. 3 days later, Grant sat in a sterilized bank office surrounded by lawyers. The stack of documents was 3 inches thick. Every page required a signature that bound him to a debt so large it felt like a physical weight on his chest. The loan officer, a man with a soft handshake and cold eyes, pushed the final page forward. "This is the personal guarantee, Mr. Foster. It states that in the event of default, the bank has the right to seize all personal assets listed in Exhibit A." Exhibit A, the house in Lincoln Park, the truck, the savings accounts, everything. Grant hesitated. For a split second, the fear paralyzed him. He saw the formula spilled on the floor 7 years ago. He felt the cold wind of the open window. Then he thought of Leo and Mia. He didn't want to just give them a home. He wanted to give them a kingdom. He wanted to build something so solid that even if he died, they would stand on a foundation of steel. Grant gripped the pen. He signed his name. The ink flowed dark and permanent. Grant Foster. He stood up, his legs shaking slightly but his face impassive. He walked out of the bank and into the crisp Chicago air. He pulled out his phone and called the sign company. "This is Grant," he said, his voice deep and steady. "I need a new sign for the HQ. Take down Sullivan Construction." "What are we putting up, sir?" Grant looked at the skyline, reclaiming it piece by piece. "Foster and Sons," he said. "Make the letters big." The sign on the glass door now read, "Foster and Sons," etched in bold, uncompromising black letters. But inside the office, the atmosphere was anything but secure. The acquisition debt was a living thing breathing down Grant's neck, consuming cash flow faster than the concrete could dry on their smaller projects. They needed a whale. They needed the Sterling building. It was 2:00 a.m. on a Thursday. The rest of the staff had gone home hours ago, leaving the 44th floor of the downtown office silent, save for the hum of the HVAC system and the scratching of a pencil on vellum. Grant stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the glittering grid of Chicago. He held a lukewarm coffee in one hand, his other hand clenched in his pocket. "Stop pacing," Rachel said. She didn't look up from the drafting table. "You're vibrating the floorboards." Grant turned. Rachel Green was 32 now, possessing a sharp, elegant beauty that she hid behind oversized glasses and tailored blazers. She was the only person in the world besides his children who wasn't afraid of him. "The presentation is in 6 hours, Rachel." Grant said, his voice tight. "If the Sterling board passes on this, we miss the quarterly loan payment. The bank takes the house. The bank takes the company." "They won't pass," Rachel said calmly. She blew a stray eraser, shaving off the paper. "Because the design is perfect, and because you're going to sell it to them not as a building, but as a legacy." She stood up and stretched her spine, popping. She walked over to the architectural model sitting on the central display table. It was a 50-story tower of glass and steel designed to catch the light off the lake at dawn. It was her masterpiece. Grant walked over to stand beside her. They were close, dangerously close. In the vacuum of the empty office, the professional distance they usually maintain felt thin. "You really think it's enough?" Grant asked his guard, slipping for a fraction of a second. Rachel looked at him, not at the model. "I know it is. Just like I know you're the only man in this city who can build it without cutting corners." She reached out her hand, hovering over his forearm, then resting there. A warm, solid weight. "Grant, you've done the impossible. You need to breathe. You're not in the trench anymore." The touch sent a jolt through Grant that was more terrifying than any debt collector. It was a reminder of softness, of Savannah's hand on his arm before she plunged the knife in. Grant pulled his arm away abruptly, stepping back as if burned. "I can't breathe," he said, his voice turning cold and flat. "Breathing is for people who don't have $4 million in debt. I need to focus." The hurt flashed across Rachel's face, quick, sharp, and then gone, replaced by a mask of professional indifference. She adjusted her glasses. "Right. Focus." "I'm doing this for the boys." Grant added a defensive reflex. "Everything is for them. I don't have room for complications." "I didn't ask to be a complication, Grant," Rachel said quietly. "I just wanted to be a partner." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with things unsaid. Grant wanted to apologize. He wanted to tell her that she was the reason he was still standing, but the fear was a padlock on his throat. 6 hours later, they stood in the boardroom of Sterling Capital. The air was thick with skepticism. The board members were old money men who looked at Grant's rough hands and saw a laborer, not an executive. Grant stood at the head of the table. He didn't look at his notes. He looked at the CEO, Victoria Sterling. "You can hire the big firms from New York," Grant said, his voice filling the room. "They'll build you a tower. It will be on time and it will be on budget, but it will be soulless. It will be just another zip code." He gestured to Rachel, who unveiled the model. A collective gasp went around the table. The light caught the glass angles, making the tower look like a lighthouse rising from the pavement. "My partner designed this to reflect the city," Grant continued, "and I will build it to outlast us all. Foster and Sons doesn't build for the next fiscal quarter. We build for the next century. You want a legacy? Here it is. Victoria Sterling looked at the model, then at Grant. She saw the hunger in him. She saw the desperation and the iron will. When can you break ground? She asked. Grant didn't smile. He just nodded. Tomorrow. Walking out of the building an hour later, the contract signed, the sun was blinding. They had done it. They were safe. We should celebrate, Rachel said, though her voice was tentative now. Dinner, real food. Grant checked his watch. I can't. I have to pick up the boys from lacrosse practice. And then I have to go over the subcontractor bids. He opened the door of his truck. He paused, looking back at her. She looked small against the backdrop of the massive stone pillars. Good work today, Rachel, he said. Get some sleep. We start digging at 6 a.m. He drove away, leaving her on the curb. He told himself it was necessary. He told himself he was protecting the empire. But as he merged into traffic, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, he knew he was just protecting himself. 12 years after the night of the empty ring, the Chicago skyline looked different. It was denser, sharper, and dominated by the silhouette of the Sterling building, a glass needle that pierced the clouds. And on the 44th floor, in a corner office that smelled of leather and espresso, Grant Foster stood as the master of that view. He was 42 now. The gray had settled into his temples and beard, turning him into a silver fox of the industry. He wore tailored Italian suits, but he still wore the same steel-toed boots when he visited sites. He was a man who knew the cost of every bolt and beam in the city. The television on the wall was muted, flashing red chirons, market correction, real estate bubble bursts, bankruptcy filings soar. It's a bloodbath out there, Grant, Rachel said. She was sitting at the conference table reviewing the quarterly earnings. She hadn't aged. She had simply ripened into a formidable executive presence. Rivers Development just halted construction on the marina project. They can't pay the contractors. Grant didn't turn from the window. I know. I hired his concrete crew this morning. They haven't been paid in 6 weeks. Are we exposed? No, Grant said, finally turning. His face was a mask of calm. We built on cash reserves. We built on equity. We didn't gamble on futures like Chase did. Let it burn. We'll buy the land for pennies on the dollar when the smoke clears. While Grant stood on solid ground 1,000 miles away in Miami, the ground was dissolving under Savannah Moore's feet. The sprawling waterfront mansion in Coral Gables was silent, stripped of the parties and the laughter that had defined the last decade. Instead, there were men in coveralls moving through the rooms, tagging furniture with yellow stickers. Savannah sat on the edge of a white silk sofa, one of the few things not yet tagged. At 38, she was still beautiful, but it was a brittle, anxious beauty. The Florida sun had etched fine lines around her eyes, and the stress of the last 6 months had thinned her frame. You said it was just a liquidity issue, Chase, she hissed at the man pacing by the pool doors. Chase Rivers looked nothing like the golden god she had run away with. He was bloated from stress eating and too much scotch. His shirt was untucked, his hair a mess. It is liquidity, Chase shouted, his charisma replaced by panic. The banks froze the lines of credit. It's a conspiracy. They're coming after me. They're taking the cars, Chase. They're taking the house. Savannah's voice trembled. Where are we supposed to go? Chase stopped pacing. He looked at her, and for the first time, Savannah saw the emptiness in his eyes. There was no love there. There never had been. She was just another asset he had acquired, and now she was a liability he couldn't afford. I don't know where you're going, Chase spat, but I have to get to the Caymans before the freeze order hits. You're on your own, babe. On my own? Savannah stood up, her hands shaking. I left my family for you. I left my children. And whose fault was that? Chase sneered. Don't pretend you're a victim, Savannah. You like the yacht. You like the diamonds. Well, the ride's over. He walked out the door without looking back. Savannah stood alone in the echo of the empty mansion. Tears blurred her vision, hot and humiliating. She walked over to the coffee table where a stack of mail and magazines lay ignored. Her hand brushed against a copy of Forbes. The cover story was titled "The Builders of the New Economy," and there, staring back at her, was a face she hadn't seen in 12 years. Grant. He looked powerful. He looked dangerous. He looked like a king. He wasn't the dusty, tired man she had left. He was a titan, and standing slightly behind him in the photo, looking at him with undeniable respect, was a woman Savannah didn't recognize Rachel. Savannah read the caption, "Grant Foster, CEO of Foster & Sons on building an empire from the ashes." A sob ripped through her throat. She looked around the repossessed mansion. She had chased the gold paint and missed the solid gold bar. She had traded a man who would have died for her for a man who just left her to the wolves. But then her eyes drifted to the sidebar of the article. Foster lives in Chicago with his 2 children, Leo and Mia. Leo and Mia. They would be 14 now. Savannah wiped her face. The despair hardened into something else, something desperate and calculating. She had nothing left. No money, no home, no youth to trade on, but she had a biological claim. She picked up her phone. Her service was scheduled to be cut off at midnight. She opened the airline app and used the last remaining credit on a card Chase hadn't canceled yet. One-way ticket. Miami to O'Hare. Back in Chicago, Grant felt a sudden chill, despite the climate control of his office. He rubbed the back of his neck. "You okay?" Rachel asked, closing her laptop. "Yeah," Grant said, looking at the gray clouds gathering over the lake. "Just a feeling, like a storm is shifting direction." "The forecast says clear skies," Rachel noted. "Not that kind of storm," Grant murmured. He checked his watch. "I'm going home. The kids have a debate tournament tomorrow. I want to make sure they're ready." "Grant," Rachel said softly, "you're a good father." "I'm the only father they have," he replied, stating it like a fact, not a boast. He walked out of the office, the heavy glass doors clicking shut behind him. He thought he was walking toward the sanctuary of his home. He didn't know he was walking toward the ghost of his past. The lobby of the Foster & Sons headquarters was a cathedral of limestone and glass designed to intimidate. It was a place where deals were made in hushed tones and where security guards in dark suits watched the revolving doors with hawk-like precision. Savannah Moore stood at the reception desk, shivering. Her linen dress, perfect for a Miami brunch, was woefully inadequate for a blustery Chicago October. She wrapped her thin cardigan tighter around herself, conscious of the way the receptionist, a girl young enough to be her daughter, scanned her frayed designer purse and windblown hair. "I'm here to see Grant Foster," Savannah said, trying to summon the imperious tone she used to wield at country clubs. "Tell him it's his wife." The receptionist didn't blink. "Mr. Foster is unmarried. Do you have an appointment?" The correction stung more than the cold. "I am Savannah Moore. Just call him, please." 44 floors up, the intercom on Grant's desk buzzed. He was in the middle of reviewing the schematics for the River North expansion with Rachel. "Yes," Grant pressed the button. "Sir, there is a Ms. Savannah Moore in the lobby. She claims, well, she says she knows you." Grant's hand froze over the blueprint. The pen in his fingers snapped with a sharp crack. Rachel looked up, her eyes wide. She knew the name. Everyone who worked close to Grant knew the ghost story of the woman who left. "Grant," Rachel warned, her voice low, "you don't have to do this. I can have security escort her out." Grant slowly unclenched his hand, dropping the broken pieces of the pen into the trash. He stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the ants crawling on the pavement below. He had spent 12 years building walls to keep the world out, but he knew that some things had to be faced at eye level. "Send her up," Grant said into the intercom. Then he turned to Rachel. "Stay." "Grant, this is personal." "This is business," he corrected, buttoning his suit jacket. "She's a liability from a failed partnership. I want a witness." When the elevator doors slid open, Grant didn't move from behind his massive oak desk. He watched Savannah step out. The memory of her vibrant laughing, smelling of expensive vanilla, clashed violently with the reality standing on his plush carpet. She looked hollowed out. Her tan was fading into a sallow yellow, her eyes were rimmed with red, and she carried the unmistakable scent of desperation. She walked into the office, her heels clicking nervously. She stopped when she saw Rachel standing by the window, arms crossed. "Grant," Savannah breathed, ignoring Rachel. She tried to smile, but her lip quivered. "My God, look at this place. Look at you." "Sit down, Savannah," Grant said. He didn't stand up. He didn't offer a hand. His voice was the temperature of the lake in January. Savannah faltered, then sank into one of the leather guest chairs. I didn't know if you'd see me. It's been so long." 12 years, 3 months, and 4 days, Grant recited, since you left a note next to the unpaid electric bill. Savannah flinched. I made a mistake, Grant. I was young. I was drowning. You were always working, and I lost myself. But I never stopped thinking about you, about us. There is no us, Grant said flatly. There hasn't been since you got into that car. Why are you here? Savannah leaned forward, tears welling up in her eyes. It was a performance Grant recognized from a dozen arguments in their 20s, but the audience had changed. Chase is gone, she sobbed. He ruined everything. He took my youth and left me with nothing. I realized what I walked away from. I want to see them, Grant. I want to see my babies. I want to see Leo and Mia. The mention of the name sucked the air out of the room. Grant placed his hands flat on the desk. They aren't babies, Savannah. They are 14 years old. They are honor students. They are athletes. And they are strangers to you. I'm their mother, she cried, her voice rising. Biologically, yes, Grant said. But you weren't there when Leo had pneumonia. You weren't there when Mia broke her arm. You weren't there for the nightmares or the birthdays. You resigned from that position. I have rights. You have nothing, Grant said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You abandoned them. I have sole custody. I have the court orders. If you go near them, if you try to pull them into your mess, I will bury you under so much legal paperwork you won't see the sun for a decade. Savannah recoiled, looking at him with genuine fear. This wasn't the blue-collar husband she could manipulate. This was a man who moved mountains for a living. I have nowhere to go, Grant, she whispered, the fight draining out of her. I'm sleeping in a motel by the airport. I have $20 to my name. Please, for old time's sake. Grant looked at her. He felt a flicker of something, not love, not hate, but a profound, exhausting pity. He opened his drawer and pulled out a checkbook. He wrote a check and slid it across the desk. Savannah grabbed it. Her eyes widened at the number. $5,000. That will get you an apartment and a warm coat, Grant said. It's not a settlement. It's severance. Get on your feet. Get a job. But stay away from my family. Savannah clutched the check, looking from the money to Grant's stony face. She realized then that the door wasn't just closed, it had been bricked over. You've changed, she said bitterly, standing up. I had to, Grant replied. Now get out. Grant had assumed the check would buy him distance. He had calculated Savannah's desperation, but underestimated her entitlement. He forgot that a woman who could walk out on 2 toddlers was capable of justifying anything to herself, including ambush. It was a crisp Tuesday afternoon. Grant was on site at the River North project, wearing a hard hat and reviewing the windload specs for the glass curtain wall. His phone rang. It was the headmaster of St. Catherine's Preparatory. Mr. Foster, the headmaster's voice was tight. We have a situation. A woman approached Leo and Mia after lacrosse practice. She claims to be Mrs. Foster. The blueprints dropped from Grant's hands, rolling into the dirt. I'm 10 minutes away. Do not let her take them. Do not let her speak to them again. Grant drove his truck onto the sidewalk to get around a delivery van, breaking 3 traffic laws on the way to the school. His heart wasn't hammering with fear. It was hammering with a cold, homicidal rage. When he screeched into the school parking lot, he saw them. Leo and Mia were standing by the main brick archway, their lacrosse sticks in hand. They looked small, confused, and rattled. Standing 5 feet away, held back by a security guard, was Savannah. She looked polished, wearing a new coat bought with his money, her face arranged in a mask of tragic longing. Grant! Savannah called out as he stormed out of the truck. They wouldn't let me hug them, my own children. Grant didn't look at her. He walked straight to his kids. He placed his large hands on their shoulders, physically turning them away from her. Get in the truck, he ordered, his voice leaving no room for argument. Dad! Leo said, his voice cracking. He was taller now, lanky and awkward, with dark eyes that were searching Grant's face. She said you told her she couldn't come back. She said she wrote letters. In the truck, now. Mia, sharper and more cynical than her brother, glared at Savannah before climbing into the back seat. Leo hesitated, looking back at the woman who was weeping theatrically into a tissue before following his sister. Grant slammed the truck door. He turned to Savannah. The security guard stepped back, sensing the violence radiating off the man. "You took my money," Grant said, stepping into her personal space until she had to crane her neck to look at him. "And you used it to buy a ticket to harass minors." "I have a right to tell them my side of the story," Savannah hissed. "You painted me as a monster, Grant. I saw the way Leo looked at me. He wants to know me. He has my eyes, Grant. He has my soul." Grant flinched. The mention of Leo's eyes hit a nerve so deep it nearly brought him to his knees. But he stood tall. "If you come within 500 feet of them again," Grant said, "I will have you arrested for trespassing and harassment. This is your one warning." He turned and walked away, ignoring her screaming his name. The drive home was suffocating. Silence filled the cab of the truck, thicker than concrete. When they got to the house in Lincoln Park, a modern fortress of stone and wood that Grant had designed himself, Rachel was waiting in the kitchen. She had clearly sensed the emergency from Grant's text. Grant paced the living room while the kids sat on the sofa, still in their uniforms. "Is it true?" Mia asked, breaking the silence. "Did she write letters? Did you hide them?" "No," Grant said, stopping his pacing. "She didn't write. She didn't call. She didn't send a birthday card for 12 years. She's lying, Mia. She's broke, and she's looking for a way in." "She didn't look like a liar," Leo said quietly. He was staring at his hands. "She looked sad. She said she made a mistake and tried to come back, but you blocked her." "I protected you," Grant snapped, his voice rising too loud. "There is a difference." Rachel stepped forward, placing a hand on Grant's arm. "Grant, breathe." She turned to the kids. "Your father loves you. He has spent every day of the last 12 years making sure you were safe. It's been a shock. Why don't you guys go upstairs and wash up? I'll order pizza." Mia grabbed her bag and stormed upstairs. Leo lingered for a second, looking at Grant with a mix of betrayal and confusion before following. When they were gone, Grant collapsed onto the sofa, putting his head in his hands. "She's poisoning them," Grant whispered. 5 minutes. That's all it took. 5 minutes to undo 12 years. Rachel sat beside him, keeping a respectful distance. "She's not poisoning them, Grant. She's answering a question they've had their whole lives. Why did she leave? You can't just villainize her anymore. You have to deal with the reality." "You don't understand," Grant said, looking up. His eyes were haunted. "It's not just about her leaving. It's about Leo. If she gets her claws into him, if she realizes—" He stopped. "Realizes what?" Rachel asked, her architect's ear catching the structural flaw in his sentence. Grant stood up, walking to the window that overlooked the garden. He had built this house to be impenetrable, but he realized now that the enemy was already inside the gates. "Nothing," Grant lied. "Just that she'll break his heart again. And I don't know if I can fix it this time." The meeting took place at the Sapphire Lounge, a dimly lit bar on the ground floor of a hotel 2 blocks from Grant's office. It was neutral ground, public enough to prevent a scene, dark enough to hide secrets. Grant arrived precisely at 7 p.m. He didn't order a drink. He sat in the leather booth, his back to the wall, watching the door. Savannah walked in 5 minutes late. She had changed tactics. The tragic, wind-blown mother from the school parking lot was gone. In her place was the woman Grant remembered from the end of their marriage, sharp, calculating, and hungry. She wore the new coat like armor and ordered a martini before she even sat down. "You look tired, Grant," she said, sliding into the booth. "Empire building must be exhausting." "Name your price," Grant said. He didn't have the patience for small talk. "You didn't call me here to catch up. You called because the 5,000 ran out and you realized you can't manipulate the kids as easily as you thought." Savannah took a long sip of her drink, leaving a lipstick stain on the rim. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You're right. I can't charm you anymore. You've become hard, like concrete." She set the glass down. "So let's talk business. I want a settlement, a real one. I want $5 million. Grant let out a short, dry laugh. "You're delusional. You abandoned the marriage. You have no claim to my assets. No judge in Illinois would give you a dime." "I'm not talking about a judge," Savannah said softly. She leaned across the table, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I'm talking about Leo." Grant went very still. The noise of the bar, the clinking glasses, the jazz music faded into a dull hum. "What about him?" "He's a smart boy," Savannah said, twirling the olive in her glass. And he's observant. I saw him looking at you yesterday. He doesn't look like you, Grant. He doesn't have your jaw. He doesn't have your build. He has Chase's eyes. Grant didn't blink. He felt the blood turn to ice in his veins, but he kept his face impassive. Chase Rivers. Savannah continued savoring the name. You remember the timeline, don't you? Before I left, there were those late nights, the business trips. I did the math, Grant. And I think deep down you did too. But you were too proud to admit it. You raised another man's son because you couldn't handle the shame of knowing your wife was sleeping with a billionaire while you were pouring cement. She sat back looking triumphant. Imagine what that would do to a 14-year-old boy. To know that his father is just the man who got stuck with him. To know that his real father was a tycoon, a man of status, and you hid it from him out of spite. Grant stared at her. He saw the cruelty in her. She was willing to detonate her own son's identity just to secure a payout. She believed that Grant was living in ignorance or fear of this truth. So that's your play, Grant said quietly. Blackmail. It's leverage, Savannah corrected. 5 million. Or I sit down with Leo tomorrow and tell him everything. I'll tell him about his real father. I'll tell him you're a liar who stole his birthright. Grant looked at his hands on the table. They were strong hands. Hands that had built skyscrapers. Hands that had changed thousands of diapers and wiped away thousands of tears. He realized then that Savannah didn't understand him at all. She thought the paternity was a weakness. She thought it was a source of shame. She had no idea it was his greatest source of pride. Grant stood up. He threw a $100 bill on the table for her drink. You want to tell him? Grant asked, looking down at her. Fine. You don't have to wait until tomorrow. Savannah blinked, confused by his reaction. What? Come to the house tonight, Grant said. His voice was deadly calm. 8:00 p.m. We'll sit down with the kids, and you can tell them whatever you want. You're bluffing, Savannah sneered. You won't let me blow up your perfect little family. Be there at 8, Grant said, turning to walk away. Don't be late. We start dinner on time. He walked out into the cold night air. He wasn't bluffing. He was done hiding. If Savannah wanted a war, he would give her one. But she was bringing a knife to a gunfight, and she didn't even know the gun was loaded. The dining room of the Foster house was designed to look like a sanctuary walnut table. Warm lighting, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the garden. But tonight it felt like a courtroom. Grant sat at the head of the table. Leo and Mia sat on one side, their dinner untouched. They sensed the vibration in the air, the kind of static charge that precedes a lightning strike. Rachel stood in the doorway of the kitchen, a silent sentinel, ready to intervene, but knowing she couldn't. The doorbell rang at 8:00 p.m. sharp. Grant didn't get up. Let her in, Rachel. A moment later, Savannah walked in. She had reapplied her lipstick, a shade of crimson that looked violent against her pale skin. She didn't look at the house or the furniture or the life she had missed. She looked only at Leo. Mom, Leo asked, his voice cracking. He stood up halfway, uncertain. Sit down, Leo, Grant said. His voice was soft, but it carried the weight of a command. Savannah remained standing. She gripped the back of the empty chair opposite the kids. She looked at Grant, waiting for him to offer the check to beg her to stop. Grant just folded his hands on the table. Go ahead, Savannah. Tell them what you told me at the bar. Savannah's eyes narrowed. She hadn't expected him to open the door for her. But the anger at his arrogance, at his success, at the way he looked at her, like she was a stain on his floor, pushed her over the edge. She turned to Leo. I wanted to protect you from this. She began, her voice trembling with feigned emotion. But your father, this man, he has built this whole life on a lie. What are you talking about? Mia snapped, protective of her brother. I'm talking about who you are, Leo. Savannah set her gaze, locking onto her son. Look at him, Leo. Look at Grant. Do you see yourself in him? Do you see his hands? His face? Leo looked at Grant. He looked at the man who had taught him to throw a ball, who had held him when he had the flu, who had built a company so he could inherit it. I don't understand, Leo whispered. Grant isn't your father, Savannah said. The words hung in the air, toxic and heavy. Your father was Chase Rivers, a billionaire, a powerful man. I was in love with him. And when you were born, Grant knew, or he should have known, but he kept you. He kept you to punish me. He stole you from your birthright. The silence that followed was deafening. Mia gasped, covering her mouth. Leo looked like he had been punched in the gut. He turned slowly to Grant, his eyes wide with a terrifying question. "Is it true?" Leo asked. "Dad?" Savannah smiled a small, cruel victory. She had dropped the bomb. Now she waited for the rubble. Grant didn't flinch. He didn't look at Savannah. He looked straight at Leo. "Yes," Grant said. Savannah's smile widened. She had won. Biologically, Grant continued, his voice steady as a heartbeat. "Half of your DNA came from Chase Rivers." Grant reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a folded, yellowed piece of paper. It was creased and worn as if it had been handled 1,000 times. He slid it across the mahogany table toward Leo. "What is this?" Leo asked, his hands shaking as he touched the paper. "A paternity test," Grant said. "From the week you were born." Savannah froze. You knew." "I knew before I signed the birth certificate," Grant said, his eyes finally shifting to Savannah, cold and hard as diamond. "I knew when I saw his eyes in the delivery room. I knew when the test came back confirming 0% probability." "And you kept him," Savannah's voice faltered. "Why, to trap me?" "No," Grant said. He stood up, then rising to his full height, casting a shadow over the table. "I didn't keep him to trap you. I didn't keep him because I was tricked. I kept him because when I held him in that hospital room, he wasn't Chase Rivers' son. He was the boy who fell asleep on my chest." Grant walked around the table and stood behind Leo's chair. He placed a hand on Leo's shoulder. Leo didn't pull away. "Being a father isn't about biology, Savannah," Grant said, his voice thickening with emotion for the first time. "It's not about DNA. It's about showing up. It's about the fever at 2 a.m. It's about the science projects. It's about the work. Chase Rivers contributed genetic material. I contributed my life." Grant looked down at Leo. "I had a choice, Leo. Every day for 14 years I had a choice. I could have walked away. I could have been bitter. But I chose you. I chose you every single morning. You are my son because I earned that title, not because of an accident of biology." Leo looked up. There were tears in his eyes, but the fear was gone. He looked at the hand on his shoulder, the rough, scarred hand of the man who had built their world. "Dad," Leo choked out. He reached up and covered Grant's hand with his own. The gesture broke Savannah. She stepped back, realizing that the weapon she had brought, the truth, had been disarmed years ago by a much stronger force. Grant hadn't lied to Leo. He had loved him enough to make the truth irrelevant. "You knew," Savannah whispered, backing toward the door. "You knew the whole time and you never said a word." "I didn't need to," Grant said. "He's a foster. He always has been." Grant pointed to the door. "You tried to sell my son back to me, Savannah. But you can't sell what you never owned. Get out of my house." Savannah looked at Leo, hoping for a glance at connection. But Leo was looking at his father. Mia was looking at her brother. The wall was solid. There were no cracks. Savannah turned and fled, the heavy front door slamming shut behind her, echoing like the final note of a funeral march. Grant let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for 14 years. He squeezed Leo's shoulder one last time. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner," Grant said softly. Leo stood up and wrapped his arms around Grant, burying his face in his father's chest. "It doesn't matter," Leo sobbed. "It doesn't matter." The silence that followed the slamming of the front door was not empty. It was heavy with relief, like the air after a fever breaks. For a long time, nobody moved. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and the ragged breathing of a family that had just survived a collision. Grant finally exhaled, his shoulders dropping 2 inches. He looked at the uneaten dinner, then at his children. The paternity test lay on the table between them, a piece of paper that had been a grenade for 14 years, now diffused and harmless. "I'm not hungry," Leo said, his voice thick. "Me neither," Mia added, wiping her eyes. Grant picked up the yellowed paper. He didn't tear it up. He didn't burn it. He simply folded it and put it back in his pocket. It was part of the history, and Grant Foster didn't destroy history. He built on top of it. "Get your coats," Grant said quietly. "Where are we going?" Rachel asked, stepping forward from the kitchen archway. "To see what we built," Grant replied, looking at her with a softness that had been absent for a decade. You too, Rachel. You're coming with us. 30 minutes later, the freight elevator of the Sterling building opened onto the private observation deck of the 90-story tower. The wind up here was fierce, whipping off Lake Michigan with a howl that drowned out the noise of the traffic below. The city was a sprawling grid of amber and white lights, a galaxy of electricity that stretched to the horizon. Leo and Mia walked to the glass railing, looking down at the city they had grown up in. They looked small against the backdrop of the night, but they stood tall. Grant stood back near the elevator with Rachel. He watched his son. Leo wasn't looking for a ghost anymore. He was looking at the world his father had conquered for him. You took a big risk, Rachel said, her voice fighting the wind. Telling him. It wasn't a risk, Grant said. He leaned against the concrete parapet he had poured steel he had ordered. It was the only way to kill the doubt. If I hid it, I was a liar. If I owned it, I was a father. He turned to Rachel. For 12 years, she had been his architect, his sounding board, his soldier. She had waited in the wings while he fought his ghosts. Grant reached out and took her hand. It was cold. He pulled her closer, breaking the professional distance he had maintained like a religion. I couldn't have done it without you, Grant said. The building, the company, the kids. You were the mortar, Rachel. I was just the bricks. Rachel squeezed his hand, her eyes shining in the reflection of the city lights. I'm not going anywhere, Grant. I know, he said, and I'm done pushing you away. Grant walked over to the railing, joining the twins. He stood between them, wrapping one arm around Mia and the other around Leo. They leaned into him, a solid, indivisible unit. Far out over the lake, a single airplane was climbing into the dark sky, its blinking red lights growing smaller and smaller as it headed south. It was just a plane, one of hundreds that left O'Hare every night. But to Grant, it felt final. He imagined Savannah on a flight like that, heading back to whatever hollow life she could scrape together. He felt no anger. He felt no vindication. He just felt light. The weight he had carried since that rainy night in the loft was gone. Dad, Leo asked, looking at the plane, do you think she'll come back? Grant watched the red light disappear into the clouds. No, Grant said firmly. She's part of the past, Leo. We don't live there. We live here. He gestured to the skyline, the jagged, beautiful, tough city that had tried to break him and failed. Look at this, Grant said to his children. We started in a basement with nothing but debt and diapers. Now we're standing on top of the world. Remember this feeling? Nobody gave this to us. We took the broken pieces and we made something permanent. Leo looked at his father. In the harsh lighting of the roof, he saw the gray hairs, the lines around the eyes, the scars on the hands. He didn't see biology. He saw sacrifice. I love you, Dad, Leo said. I love you too, son. Grant replied, his voice rough with the truth of it. Grant pulled them all in, Leo, Mia, and Rachel, into a huddle against the wind. The cold Chicago air bit at their faces, but Grant Foster finally felt warm. He had built his empire. But standing there holding the people who mattered, he realized the empire wasn't the steel or the glass or the millions in the bank. The empire was this. All right, Grant said, turning them back toward the warmth of the elevator. Let's go home. We have work to do tomorrow.